The military airlifted survivors at dawn during the zombie outbreak, but I was told to stay behind. The helicopter rotors started at 4:47 a.m. I know because I checked my watch when the sound woke me, the way you check the time during an earthquake. Not because it matters, but because your brain reaches for anything structured when the world tilts. I was sleeping on a folding cot in processing tent C, which was what the military had named a canvas rectangle staked into the mud of the Jefferson County Fairgrounds. 11 days since the first infections hit St. Louis. 9 days since the National Guard rolled into the surrounding counties, with evacuation orders broadcast from speakers bolted to Humvee roofs. 6 days since I'd walked 7 miles from my apartment in Festus, with a backpack, a jug of water, and a framed photograph of my daughter I couldn't make myself leave on the nightstand. The photograph was stupid to bring. I knew that then. I know it now. But my hands made a decision my head hadn't authorized. And here I was, in a tent that smelled like wet dog and diesel, listening to Blackhawks spin up in the dark. The man on the cot beside mine was already sitting upright. His name was Gerald Toomey, 61 years old, retired pipe fitter from Herculaneum, and the calmest human being I'd met since the world started eating itself. Gerald had a way of breathing slow, deliberate, almost theatrical, that made you think he'd seen this exact catastrophe before and had decided it wasn't worth the adrenaline. He looked at me across the 3 feet of mud between our cots and said, "That's the airlift." I was already pulling my boots on. Everyone in the tent was. You could hear the shuffling, the zipping, the low murmur of people assembling themselves in the dark, with the efficiency of passengers who've heard the boarding call and are afraid the plane will leave without them. Which, it turned out, was exactly what was happening. Outside, the fairgrounds were moving. Floodlights cast hard white circles across the mud. And inside those circles, people were walking fast toward the north field, where 3 Blackhawks sat with their rotors turning. Soldiers stood at intervals along a rope line, rifles across their chests, faces impossible to read beneath helmets and night vision mounts that gave them the look of insects standing upright. I counted maybe 300 people moving in the same direction, and for a moment it felt organized, almost festive, like a night launch at a county fair, everyone shuffling toward the same ride. Gerald was beside me. He had his bag over one shoulder, a neat canvas duffel that contained, as far as I could tell, 3 changes of clothes, a Bible, a bag of pistachios, and a small revolver he thought nobody knew about. We walked together toward the rope line, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the part where it works, where the machinery of the government does what it's supposed to do, and moves people from danger to safety the way it moves mail from sorting facility to mailbox. I was 38 years old. My name is Dana Weber. I'm a veterinary technician, or I was, at a small animal clinic in Festus that is certainly now either burned or overrun or both. I'm telling you my profession because it becomes relevant, and because I want you to understand what I am: not a soldier, not a doctor, not an engineer. A woman who held dogs still while needles went in, and who mopped surgical tables, and who once, in an emergency, assisted in a cesarean section on a Rottweiler and cried afterward in the parking lot because all 6 puppies lived. That's who was walking toward the helicopters. That's who got stopped. The soldier at the rope checkpoint had a clipboard. He also had a flashlight, which he pointed at my face without apology, then down at the paper. I gave him my name. He scanned the list. He scanned it again. Gerald, behind me, had already been waved through and was walking toward the north field with his duffel bouncing against his hip. The soldier looked up at me and said, "You're not on the manifest." I said, "There's a mistake." He said, "Step to the left, ma'am." I didn't step to the left. I stood there while the line behind me compressed and people started murmuring, and the rotor washed from the Blackhawk's blue grit into my eyes. I said my name again. Spelled it. He checked again. I watched his eyes move down the list, and I watched them reach the bottom, and I watched them come back up to mine, with nothing in them. No cruelty, no sympathy, just the flat, operational blankness of a man executing a task. You're not on the manifest. Step to the left. There was a folding table set up near the east gate of the rope line. Behind it sat a woman in army fatigues with a laptop whose screen cast blue light across her jaw. She was the appeals station, the place they funneled you when the checkpoint said no and you didn't walk away quietly. There were 4 people ahead of me. A man with a toddler on his hip, arguing in a low, controlled voice. A teenage girl, standing alone, arms wrapped around herself. An older couple holding hands with the synchronized patience of people who had been waiting in lines together for 40 years. I stood behind them, and I watched the helicopters. The floodlights made the rotor blades into a bright, stuttering halo, and people were climbing aboard single file, assisted by soldiers who gripped forearms and pulled. I could see Gerald shape that slow, distinctive walk as he moved toward the second Blackhawk. He didn't look back. I don't hold that against him. When the door opens, you go through it. You don't pause to check who's still standing in the hall. The man with the toddler was turned away. I heard the woman behind the laptop say, civilian priority tier and medical designation and next transport cycle. And each phrase was smooth, rehearsed, designed to move a person from protest to compliance in 4 sentences. The man walked away from the table with the child's face buried in his neck, and his own face doing something I'd seen before on owners in the clinic when I told them the surgery hadn't worked. That careful blankness that isn't calm, but is the membrane you build over disintegration so you can keep walking. My turn came. The woman didn't look up immediately. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, and the blue light shifted on her skin. And I had the dislocating thought that she looked like someone at a hotel front desk checking reservations. I gave her my name. She typed. She read. She looked up. You were processed as a Category 3 intake. Non-critical skill set, no dependent minors in camp, no medical flag. Category 3 civilians are scheduled for the next available ground convoy. I said, when is the next ground convoy? She said, that hasn't been determined. I said, the roads south are closed. I walked here. I saw what's on the roads. She said, ma'am, the convoy schedule is being coordinated with forward operating. When? She paused. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has asked a question you're not allowed to answer honestly. Then she said, I'd recommend you return to your assigned tent and wait for further instructions. Behind me, the helicopters were louder. The first one was lifting off, tilting its nose slightly forward, rising above the floodlights into a sky that was just beginning to show gray at the eastern edge. I watched it go. I watched 300 people go. I watched Gerald Toomey go, and his pistachios, and his Bible, and his slow breathing that made you think everything would be fine. I walked back to Tent C. There were maybe 40 of us left in the processing area. The floodlights shut off one by one as the remaining Blackhawks climbed away, and in the new darkness, the fairgrounds looked like what they actually were. A muddy field in rural Missouri with temporary structures staked into it, and a chain-link perimeter fence that had been reinforced with concertina wire by soldiers who were now, by the sound of it, starting engines and pulling out. A man was standing at the entrance to Tent C. He was holding a little girl's hand. His name, I'd learned within the hour, was Marcus Cole. The girl was his daughter, Bree. She was 7. He looked at me as I walked up and he said, They left. I said, Yeah, he said. They left us. I didn't answer that. I walked into the tent and sat on my cot and put the framed photograph of my daughter in my lap and stared at the face in it. Emma, 14 years old, living with her father in Carbondale, Illinois, which was either safe or not safe. I had no way to know. My phone had died on day 3. The cell towers had gone dark on day 5. My daughter was a fixed point in a geography I could no longer verify, and I was sitting in a tent on a fairgrounds that the United States military had just abandoned with the casual efficiency of someone checking out of a motel. The eastern sky was getting lighter. Somewhere south, toward the river, I heard a sound that could have been gunfire, or could have been a car backfiring, or could have been the structural failure of something large. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the sound was closer than it had been yesterday. The perimeter was 2 layers of chain link and concertina wire. The soldiers had left the wire. They had not left the soldiers. I counted the people I could see: Marcus and Bree. An older woman in a lawn chair who hadn't spoken to anyone in the 3 days I'd been here. I'd later learn her name was Ruth Pemberton. 2 young men near the water station, brothers, talking rapidly in low voices. A woman my age emerging from Tent A with a medical bag over her shoulder. 43 of us, I'd eventually confirm. Left behind by taxonomy. Sorted, graded, and found non-essential by a system that had 3 helicopters and 400 names, and had made its cuts with the bloodless precision of an admissions committee. Dawn broke over the fairgrounds like an accusation. The woman with the medical bag was named Anis Kari. She was a second-year emergency medicine resident from Barnes Jewish Hospital in St. Louis who had walked out of the city on day 4 after the hospital generators failed, and the basement morgue became a place you could hear moving. She found me in Tent C 20 minutes after dawn, already doing what doctors do: scanning, triaging, locating the people who looked like they might be useful. "You have medical training?" she asked. No introduction, no preamble. She'd seen me checking the hands of an elderly man for dehydration the day before. "Veterinary," I said. She processed this for exactly 1 second. "Close enough. I need someone who can follow instructions with a needle and isn't going to freeze." That's how I became her second. Not by volunteering, not by committee, but by the quiet arithmetic of catastrophe. She was the only medical professional among 43 people, and I was the closest thing to a backup she could find. Anis was 30, compact, dark-haired, with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been in crisis mode so long that crisis had become her neutral state. She spoke in short sentences. She made eye contact that lasted exactly as long as the information required. She had suture kits, antibiotics, and a stethoscope in that bag. She did not have enough of anything. Marcus Cole appeared in the tent entrance. Bree was behind him, gripping the back of his jacket. "We need to talk about the fence," he said. He was right, and we all knew it. The perimeter fence was chain link, 8 feet high, topped with 3 coils of concertina wire the soldiers had installed during week 1. It enclosed the fairgrounds on 3 sides. The 4th side was the parking lot, which was closed off with Jersey barriers and a vehicle gate that was now standing open because the last Humvee had driven through it 40 minutes ago without stopping to secure it behind them. I walked out with Marcus to look. The vehicle gate was a 20-foot gap in the perimeter, and through it I could see the county road, the tree line beyond, and nothing moving. But nothing moving meant nothing right now, and right now was a window that would close. The brothers at the water station were Devin and Caleb Park, 23 and 20 Korean American, from a farm outside DeSoto. Devin had been an Army reservist for 2 years before discharge. He was the one who, without being asked, had already started dragging Jersey barriers toward the open gate with a calm, mechanical focus that made me think of Gerald, that same quality of a person who'd already decided the situation was what it was and was moving directly to the next task. Caleb was helping, quieter, stronger, following his brother's spatial logic without needing instructions. We got the gate closed within an hour. Not sealed, the barriers weren't tall enough, and we had no wire for the top, but blocked enough that anything walking upright and stupid would be slowed. Devin stood back and looked at it and said, "That buys us a day, maybe." "A day for what?" Caleb asked. Nobody answered. That was the question, and its emptiness sat among us like a new member of the group. The helicopters were gone. The convoy was theoretical. The military had sorted us into a category and then left the category on the ground. A day for what? A day to wait for a system that had already demonstrated it was willing to leave us? A day to decide what we were now, that we weren't evacuees? Marcus was the one who said it first. We should take stock: food, water, medical, tools. See what they left behind. What they left behind turned out to be more than I expected and less than we needed. 3 cases of MREs in a supply tent, roughly enough for 2 days if rationed. 4 50-gallon water drums, 2 full, 2 half. A diesel generator with maybe a quarter tank. 2 folding tables, cots, tarps, a tool chest with basic hand tools. No weapons, no radios, no vehicles. The soldiers had taken everything that could communicate or kill. Anise inventoried the medical supplies in Tent A and came back with a look that told me the math before she spoke it. If nobody gets hurt, I can manage. If somebody gets hurt badly, I can't. Ruth Pemberton, the woman in the lawn chair, hadn't moved. She sat at the center of the camp with a stillness so complete it was almost gravitational. When I passed her, she said, without looking at me, "They'll come back." I said, "Maybe." She said, "They have to." I said, "Okay." And I walked on, carrying 2 MREs toward the tent where Bree Cole sat on a cot, drawing on the back of a military intake form with a pencil she'd found in the mud. By noon, the temperature had climbed to the mid-80s, and the fairground smelled like heated canvas, standing water, and the chemical sweetness of the portable toilets the Army had left behind. I was helping Annis sort medications, separating antibiotics from analgesics, counting doses, writing quantities on the back of intake forms when Devin Park came into Tent A at a walk that was trying not to be a run. "South fence," he said. 3 of them. I put down the bottle of amoxicillin I was holding and followed him outside. And there they were, visible through the chain link along the southern perimeter. 3 figures standing at the fence line, maybe 50 feet apart, facing inward. They weren't moving. They were just standing, the way people stand at a bus stop when they've forgotten where they're going. 2 men and a woman. The woman was wearing a hospital gown that was open in the back. One of the men had no shoes. They were gray in the way the infected get gray, not pale, not ashen, but a color that doesn't belong on living skin, like meat left on a counter overnight. I had seen the infected before. On the walk from Festus, I'd seen them at a distance, moving along the roadside, sometimes alone, sometimes in loose clusters that weren't quite groups and weren't quite herds. They moved with a specific gait, not shambling, not running, but a purposeful walk that had lost its coordination, like a person navigating in the dark with their hands at their sides. The sound was worse than the sight. A low vocalization, not a moan, not a growl, but something between an a continuous, toneless exhalation that sounded like a word being said so slowly it lost all its consonants. These three were quiet. They stood at the fence and their heads tracked slowly when we moved, the way a dog follows a squirrel through a window. And they didn't push, didn't grab, didn't press against the chain link. They just watched. Marcus came up beside me with Bree's hand in his. He saw the figures and turned Bree gently around so she was facing the camp. "Don't look that way, baby." Bree didn't argue. She was 7 and had already learned the geography of where not to look. "They followed the noise," Devin said. "Helicopters this morning. Sound carries out here." Caleb said, "Will more come?" Devin looked south. The land beyond the fence was a soybean field that had gone ragged, then a tree line, then the road that led toward the river, and, beyond it, the suburbs north of St. Louis where the outbreak had started. It was a straight, flat corridor, with nothing to slow movement or block sight lines. "Yeah," Devin said, "more will come." We held a meeting. Not a formal one. There was no table, no agenda, no Robert's rules. We stood in a loose circle near the water drums, and the people who wanted to talk talked, and the people who didn't stood with their arms crossed and listened. There were 43 of us. I knew maybe 12 names. The rest were faces I'd registered in the way you register fellow passengers: present, accounted for, not yet relevant. Marcus spoke first. He was a high school shop teacher from Peverly. 44, broad across the shoulders, with a voice that carried without shouting, a classroom voice built for managing attention. He laid out the situation without softening it. 3 infected at the south fence. More likely coming. No weapons, no vehicles, no communication with the military. Rations for 2 days. A perimeter that was chain link and hope. A man named Warren Griggs, 50s, denim jacket, a face like a clenched fist, said what several people were thinking. "We walk. North. Now. Before more show up." Anise shook her head. "I've got 4 people who can't walk far. Mr. Heaton has a fractured tibia set with a splint made from a tent pole. Mrs. Okafor is 8 months pregnant. There's a man in Tent B with chest pains I can't diagnose without equipment. And Ruth hasn't stood up in 2 days." Warren looked at her. "Then they stay." The silence after that had weight. It pressed down on the circle like a physical thing. And I watched people's faces change as the implications settled. Not cruelty. Warren wasn't being cruel, not exactly. He was being arithmetic. The math of who can move and who can't, who slows the group and who doesn't. It was the same math the military had used at 447 that morning. The same sorting logic, the same clean taxonomy of value. I said, "No." Warren looked at me. I said, "We don't sort people." The argument lasted 20 minutes and ended without resolution, which meant it ended with the status quo: nobody left, nobody walked, and Warren Griggs retreated to Tent B with the specific silence of a man composing his next argument. The group dispersed into tasks, because tasks were easier than decisions. Devin and Caleb continued reinforcing the vehicle gate. 2 women I didn't know yet began rationing MREs into individual portions. Anise went back to her patients. I went to the south fence to watch the 3 figures that were now 4. The 4th had arrived while we were arguing. A man, young, wearing a fast food uniform with a name tag I could almost read. He stood at the fence with the same patient stillness as the others, head turning slowly, tracking movement inside the camp. The gap between him and the nearest figure was maybe 30 feet. They didn't acknowledge each other. Whatever social wiring had connected them before the infection had been cut. And they existed now in a proximity that wasn't companionship, just coincidence of direction. I stood on my side of the chain link, and I looked at the one in the hospital gown, and I thought about a thing I hadn't let myself think about since the walk from Festus. I had been in the clinic when the first reports came through. Dr. Ellison had the radio on in the break room, and the initial language was aggressive behavior and unknown pathogen and avoid contact. Within 48 hours, the language had changed to infection and reanimation. And then, when the official vocabulary failed, the news anchors started saying zombies, with the embarrassed hesitation of adults using a child's word for a real thing. The infected weren't dead. That was what the early reports clarified, and what most people still didn't fully understand. They weren't corpses walking. They were people whose higher brain function had been overwritten by something that left the autonomic systems running heartbeat, respiration, locomotion while erasing language, recognition, empathy, self. They were bodies with the person removed, and what was left moved toward sound, toward heat, toward the vibration of living systems, with a focus that wasn't hunger and wasn't rage, but was something worse. Drive. Purposeless, mechanical, unkillable drive. I went back to the camp and found Marcus sitting on a crate outside Tent C, watching Bree draw. She was working on a picture of what appeared to be a horse, though it had too many legs, and a tail that looked like a flame. Marcus looked up at me, and I saw the thing I hadn't seen at the checkpoint, the thing behind his calm. Fear. Specific, parental, thermometer in the mouth, fear. Not for himself. How old is your daughter? He asked. 14, I said. Where? Carbondale, with her dad. He nodded. He didn't say she's probably fine or I'm sure she's okay. He just nodded, and that was better. The honest ones don't offer you a forecast they can't back up. My wife was in St. Louis, he said. She worked downtown, Washington Avenue. Day 2, the phones went out. He stopped. Bree was 6 feet away, drawing a horse with a burning tail. He reformed the sentence. I don't know what happened. I sat down on the crate beside him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, That guy Warren's not wrong about walking. He's wrong about leaving people behind. Yeah, but the walking part. We can't stay here. You saw the fence. You saw what's outside it. 2 days of food, no radio. The military's not coming back, Dana. We were the acceptable loss, the rounding error. He was right. I knew it the way I knew the amputation was necessary when the Rottweiler came in with the mangled leg, not because I wanted to know it, but because the information was there, clinical and complete, and pretending it wasn't wouldn't save the limb. So we walk, I said. All of us. We find a way to move the people who can't walk fast. Where? I'd been thinking about this since the helicopters disappeared. South was the river and the outbreak. West was open farmland, with no infrastructure. East was more of the same. North was Highway 21, and beyond it, the smaller towns. Potosi, Salem, Rolla. Smaller populations meant fewer infected. Rural terrain meant visibility. And Rolla had a university, which meant it might have been designated as a secondary evacuation point. North, I said. Marcus looked at Bree, then at me, then north, toward the flat soybean fields and the 2-lane county road and the ridge with the dead communications tower. How far? Maybe 60 miles. He exhaled. 60 miles with 43 people, 4 of whom couldn't walk, no vehicles, no weapons, and a spreading wave of infected between here and everywhere. Okay, he said. Okay. We decided to leave at dawn the next morning. That gave us 18 hours to prepare, and I spent most of them learning what 43 strangers can become when the structure that held them dissolves, and they're forced to build a new one out of nothing. Devin became our logistics. He walked the entire camp with a clipboard he'd assembled from cardboard and a binder clip, cataloging everything portable and useful. 2 tarps, a hand-crank flashlight, rope, duct tape, the tool chest, a camp stove with 1 fuel canister, the remaining MREs, water in every container we could seal. He organized it into carry weight per person and posted the list on the supply tent wall with a calm that I realized wasn't calm at all, but a disciplined suppression of panic that his military training had taught him to maintain until the mission was complete. Then, presumably, you fell apart. But not before. Marcus handled communication. He moved tent to tent, explaining the plan, asking for agreement, absorbing objections. Some people were ready. Some were afraid. Warren Griggs was already packed and made it clear he intended to walk at the front of whatever column we formed. A position I suspected had less to do with leadership and more to do with being able to peel away if the group slowed. The problem was transport for the immobile. Mr. Heaton Frank Heaton, 72, retired electrician, could not walk on his fractured tibia. Mrs. Okafor Adesi Okafor, 35, pregnant, could walk slowly but not for 60 miles over broken terrain. The man with chest pains, who turned out to be named George Devlin, was stable but unpredictable. And Ruth Pemberton simply didn't respond when Marcus knelt beside her lawn chair and explained the plan. She looked through him with eyes that had gone to a place that required no geography. Caleb Parks solved the transport problem with a solution so simple it was almost embarrassing. The fairgrounds had a maintenance shed near the east fence, and inside it were 2 ride-on lawn mowers, a flatbed utility cart designed to be towed behind a truck, and a wheelbarrow. The lawn mowers were useless, too loud, too slow, too much fuel. But the utility cart had inflatable tires and a tongue that could be pulled by hand. Caleb and Devin rigged a towing harness from rope and tarp straps, and by late afternoon we had a vehicle. Crude, slow, requiring 2 people to pull and 1 to push, but functional. Frank Heaton sat on it experimentally and declared it rode better than his ex-wife's Buick. Annie spent the afternoon on patient preparation. She resplinted Frank's leg with better materials, tent poles, and athletic tape she'd found in a first aid kit, and examined a diaze with a stethoscope, listening for fetal heartbeat with a concentration so total that the camp fell quiet around her, as if the act of listening was sacred and noise would break it. She looked up and said, "Strong, baby's fine." And Adaize's face did something I will carry with me longer than any image of the infected. It opened briefly into a joy so pure and so temporary that it hurt to witness, like sunlight through a crack in a boarded window. By late afternoon, there were 11 figures at the south fence. They'd been arriving in 1s and 2s throughout the day, drawn by the residual sound signature of the morning helicopters, or by whatever signal we were producing, thermal, acoustic, biological. They stood in their loose non-formation, and they watched and they waited with the patience of something that had no schedule and no impatience and no capacity for boredom. Devin walked the full perimeter at dusk and came back with a count. 11 south, 3 east, none north or west. He paused. "We go north, first light." I spent the evening in tent C. Bree was asleep on her cot, one hand still holding the pencil. Marcus was sitting on the floor beside her, awake, watching the tent wall as if he could see through it to whatever was out there, assembling in the dark. I sat on my cot and held Emma's photograph and tried to think about the route north, and instead thought about the last time I'd talked to my daughter, 3 days before the outbreak. An ordinary Tuesday phone call in which she'd told me about a chemistry test, and I'd told her about a Labrador we'd treated for chocolate ingestion. And she'd laughed, and I'd laughed, and neither of us had said anything important because we thought there would be more Tuesdays. I set the photograph face down on the cot. Not because I didn't want to see her. Because I needed to see the tent, the mud, the shape of Marcus guarding his daughter. The present tense. The thing that required me. At 3 a.m., I woke to a sound at the south fence. Not the low vocalization I'd heard before. Something different. A rhythmic metallic rattle, like someone shaking a chain-link gate. I lay in the dark, and I listened, and I counted the seconds between each rattle, and they were perfectly even. Mechanical. Patient. Whatever was at the fence had found a new behavior. It was testing. We left at 5:15 a.m. 43 people walking north across the fairground parking lot in a column that was less military formation and more elementary school field trip, bunched, uneven, too loud. Marcus was at the front with Bree on his shoulders, her legs dangling against his chest, her head above the group like a small lookout. Devin and Caleb pulled the utility cart with Frank Heaton and Ruth Pemberton on it, Ruth sitting upright with her purse in her lap as though she were being driven to church. Adiz walked beside the cart with one hand on its rail, steadying herself over the uneven ground. George Devlin walked under his own power, but slowly, with a niece beside him, monitoring his color and breathing. Warren Griggs was exactly where I'd predicted, 20 yards ahead of everyone, already on the county road, moving with the stiff-legged gait of a man who intended to survive this specifically and personally. I was at the rear, not by assignment, by instinct. 19 years of vet clinics had taught me that the animal most likely to bolt or collapse is the one at the back of the pack, and someone needs to be watching for it. Behind me, the fairground shrank in the early light, and I could see the south fence and the figures along it, 17 now. I counted, turning their heads in unison as our sound moved north. They didn't follow, not yet. The fence was still between us and them, and the fence, for the moment, was a question they hadn't solved. The terrain north of the camp was flat agricultural land, soybean fields gone ragged, a 2-lane county road running east-west, and beyond it, a low ridge topped with a communications tower whose red light was dark. The morning was cool, mist sitting in the low places, and the silence had that rural Missouri quality, not the absence of sound, but the presence of the wrong kind of quiet, the kind where you notice there are no birds. A dog appeared. It came out of the soybean field to our right, moving at a cautious trot, head low, tail neutral. A medium-sized mutt, brown and white, maybe 40 pounds, with the lean look of an animal that had been feeding itself for a while, but not well. It stopped at the edge of the road and regarded our column with an intelligence that was, to me, immediately legible. I speak dog. It's the one language I'm fluent in. This animal was assessing threat, proximity, and the probability of food, in that order. Bree saw it from Marcus's shoulders. "Daddy, a dog." Marcus said, "I see it, baby." The dog watched us pass. Then it fell in at the rear of the column, 20 feet behind me, matching our pace. It didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It walked with us, the way a stray follows a group that might be going somewhere with a kitchen. "You're going to name it," Annie said, appearing beside me. She'd left George with another volunteer and dropped back to check the rear. "Probably," I said. "Don't. Names make things harder." She was right. I named him Punch anyway, because he had a dark mark on his nose that looked like he'd walked into something. And because naming things is what I do when I'm afraid. It's the veterinary equivalent of the soldier's weapon check, a ritual that says, I am competent in this space. I know what to do here. I am not helpless. The dog was something I understood. The rest of this, the road, the infected, the 60 miles of uncertainty, was a terrain where my expertise was useless. But the dog I knew. We crossed the county road and started up the low ridge. The communications tower stood at the crest, skeletal against the gray sky, its red aircraft warning light dead. From the top of the ridge, we could see north for miles. A patchwork of fields, woodlots, farm buildings, and a narrow blacktop road that ran straight toward the horizon like a ruled line. No movement, no vehicles, no smoke. "That's Route M," Devin said, consulting a folded gas station map he'd found in the maintenance shed. "It runs north-northwest about 12 miles to Highway 21. From there, we pick up 72 west toward Rolla." 12 miles to the highway, Marcus said. "Can we make that today?" Devin looked at the cart, at Frank's splinted leg, at Adaise's careful steps. "Depends on the road, and on what's on it." We started north on Route M. Punch moved with purpose, nose working, ears swiveling independently like satellite dishes. I watched him because he was my instrument, a biological sensor array calibrated to detect what human senses would miss. His body language would tell me about threats before my eyes could confirm them. When his hackles went up, something was close. When his ears pinned back, something was wrong. When he stopped walking, we should all stop walking. For the first 2 miles, Punch walked easily. On the 3rd mile, he stopped. The farmhouse sat back from the road behind a gravel drive. White clapboard, green roof, a porch with a swing that was moving slightly in a wind I couldn't feel. Punch had planted himself in the center of the blacktop, with his weight shifted backward and his nose pointed at the house. And the sound he was making was not a growl, but a low, continuous vibration in his chest that I could feel through the ground. I held up my hand. The column stopped. 43 people went quiet. With a synchronization that surprised me, we were already becoming something. Already learning each other's signals. Already halfway to being a unit rather than a collection. The porch swing moved again. I saw the shape on it now, a figure. Seated, rocking slightly. Not rocking, swaying. The involuntary pendulum motion of the infected, a rhythm that had no purpose and no music. Just the body maintaining movement, because movement was what remained when everything else was gone. "One on the porch," I said quietly. Devin was beside me. "Just one?" I looked at Punch. His attention was fixed on the house, not scanning. "One source." "I think so." We go around, through the field. Keep quiet. We moved off the road, into the soybean rows, pulling the cart over soft soil that sucked at its wheels and made Caleb and Devin strain against the harness. Frank Heaton gripped the cart rails and set his jaw against the jolting. Ruth Pemberton sat motionless, purse in lap, staring straight ahead. We gave the farmhouse a wide berth 300 yards, and I watched the porch as we passed. The figure continued its metronome sway. It didn't turn. It hadn't heard us. Or if it had, the sound was below whatever threshold triggered its pursuit response. When we were clear, Marcus fell back to walk beside me. Bree was on the ground now, walking on her own, holding his hand, and I noticed she hadn't looked at the farmhouse. She'd kept her eyes on the soybeans, on the dirt, on her own shoes. 7 years old, and she'd already internalized the rule. Don't look at the things on the porches. "That's the first one on the route," Marcus said. "It won't be the last." "I know." He paused. "We need something. A weapon. Something." He was right. 43 people with no means of defense beyond hand tools and a dog was an equation that ended one way. I'd been thinking about this since we left the fairgrounds, turning it over like a problem on an exam. and every answer I produced was inadequate. The farmhouses along the road might contain guns. This was rural Missouri, after all, but entering a farmhouse meant entering a closed space where anything could be waiting in a hallway or behind a door. Devin solved it an hour later. We passed a county maintenance depot, a metal building with a fenced yard full of road equipment, and he and Caleb went in through an unlocked side gate and came out with tools: a brush axe, 2 long-handled shovels, a pry bar, a section of heavy chain. Not weapons, but objects that could function as weapons in the hands of people who understood leverage and reach. Devin handed me the pry bar. It was 3 feet of forged steel with a curved claw at one end, and it was heavy in a way that felt like honesty, like the object itself was telling me what the day would require. We covered 7 miles by noon. The road stayed empty. The fields on either side showed no movement. 3 more farmsteads appeared, and we skirted each one. Guided by Punch's behavior, twice he walked past without interest. Once he stopped and stared, and we detoured wide. The sun climbed and the temperature rose and the column stretched as the faster walkers pulled ahead and the slower ones fell back. And I found myself moving constantly between front and rear, checking, counting, making sure no one had fallen behind or wandered or sat down in the soybeans, and decided the effort wasn't worth the destination. At noon, we stopped in the shade of a tree line along a creek that crossed the road through a concrete culvert. People sat where they dropped. MREs were distributed half rations, 1 per 2 people, split and shared. Water was measured and poured with the care of a pharmacist filling a prescription. Anise checked Frank's splint, checked Adiz's vitals, checked George's pulse, and came to sit beside me with a canteen she drank from in small, deliberate sips. "Adize needs to rest more," she said. "Her ankles are swelling." "Can she make the highway?" "Today? No. We need to find somewhere to stop for the night." I looked at the map Devin had left open on the cart. 5 more miles to Highway 21. 5 miles that might as well have been 50 if we couldn't push the pace. Punch was lying at my feet, panting, watching the tree line with one ear cocked. He'd eaten half an MRE cracker I'd given him, and looked at me with an expression I'd seen on 1,000 clinic dogs, the look that said, "I don't know what's happening, but I've decided you're in charge of it." I scratched behind his ear. Then I picked up the pry bar and stood. "We go 3 more miles," I said. "Find a structure, something defensible. Rest tonight. Highway tomorrow." No one argued. They were too tired to argue. They just stood up and started walking. We found the church at mile 10. It was a small white building set back from a crossroads with a gravel parking lot, a steeple that had lost its cross to some previous storm, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Mount Horeb Baptist Church, all welcome." The doors were closed. The windows were intact. The parking lot was empty. Punch circled the building once at a trot and returned to me with his tail slightly elevated, his all-clear signal, if I was reading him right. Devin checked the doors, locked. He used the pry bar, my pry bar, which I handed over with a reluctance that surprised me, and the side door opened into a dim interior that smelled like hymnals and floor wax and the specific mustiness of a building that had been closed for weeks without ventilation. We cleared it, room by room. Devin first, brush axe in hand, then Marcus, then me. Sanctuary with 16 pews, a small office, a kitchen with a gas stove and a pantry that contained, like a small answered prayer, canned beans, canned corn, powdered milk, instant coffee, and a 5-gallon jug of water. A fellowship hall with a linoleum floor, large enough for 43 people to lie down if they didn't mind proximity. 2 bathrooms that still flushed because the building was on a well with a gravity tank. Marcus stood in the fellowship hall and said, "This'll do." The group filed in with the stunned relief of travelers reaching a hotel after a delayed flight. People claimed floor space, unrolled sleeping setups from tarps and jackets, and the murmur of low conversation started the sound of a group exhaling. Bree sat in a pew in the sanctuary and ran her hands along the wood and said, "It's like a real place." And that sentence broke something in me that I kept broken for the rest of the evening, because fixing it would have taken energy I didn't have. Annie set up her medical station in the church office. I helped her move Frank from the cart to a pew cushion on the floor, and he groaned exactly once during the transfer and then said, "Better than the Buick, still." Ruth Pemberton was guided to a corner of the fellowship hall and seated in a folding chair. And she sat in it the same way she'd sat in the lawn chair at the fairgrounds, present in body, absent in everything else. George Devlin lay down on a pew and fell asleep within minutes. His color better, his breathing even. Adias was given the office couch, where she lay on her side with her hands on her belly and her eyes closed but not sleeping. I went outside to check the perimeter. The crossroads was empty in both directions, Route M running north-south, a gravel road running east-west into farmland. The sun was low. Shadows were long. No movement anywhere. Punch was sitting by the church steps, watching the road with his ears forward. I sat beside him, and I did something I hadn't done since the morning the helicopters left. I cried. Not loud, not long. Just a controlled leak, a pressure release. The kind of crying that happens when you've been holding the edges of a wound closed for hours, and you finally get somewhere with a door that locks. I cried for Emma, because I didn't know where she was. I cried for the fairgrounds and the clipboard and the soldiers' flat eyes. I cried because I was holding a pry bar outside a Baptist church in the middle of nowhere. And I was responsible for 42 people I hadn't known 12 days ago. And a dog I'd named Punch. And the only qualification I had for any of it was that I could hold a frightened animal still. Punch leaned against my leg. He didn't lick my face or whine or perform any of the theatrical empathy that dogs are famous for. He just pressed his shoulder into my calf and stayed there, solid and warm, and that was enough. That was the correct response. Sometimes the right medicine is just proof that another living thing knows you're there. I wiped my face. I stood up. I went back inside. Warren Griggs was waiting for me in the sanctuary. He was sitting in the back pew with his arms crossed and his denim jacket zipped to the collar, and his face had the organized quality of a man who had prepared a speech. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. "At first light, walking north alone. I'm faster alone." I sat in the pew across the aisle from him. I was tired. I didn't have the energy for an argument, and I didn't have the right to stop him. "Okay," I said. He blinked. He'd expected resistance. "Okay? You're a free person, Warren. I can't make you stay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me." "No. You'd make the highway by noon, rolla by nightfall. You'd get to your daughter faster." That was the blade, and he knew exactly where to put it. I felt it go in. I felt the argument it made clean, logical, selfish, and nearly irresistible. Leave the slow ones. Leave the pregnant woman and the old man and the child. Run. Get to Carbondale. Find Emma. Be a mother instead of a stranger playing shepherd. I looked at Warren and I said, "No." He shook his head. "Then you'll die with them." "Maybe, but I won't leave them." Warren was gone before dawn. I know because Punch woke me at 4:30 with a soft whine. And when I went to the side door, it was open, and Warren's pack was gone from the corner where he'd stacked it. I stood in the doorway and looked north along Route M. and saw nothing. He'd had a head start, and he moved fast, and the dark had swallowed him completely. I closed the door and locked it, and went back to the fellowship hall, and did not tell anyone until Marcus noticed the empty corner at breakfast. He left? Yeah. Marcus processed this. Then he said, "One less mouth." And that was the end of the discussion. Nobody mourned Warren's absence, because nobody had attached to Warren. And that itself was a kind of information. You can walk beside 42 people for 2 days and remain, by the precision of your selfishness, completely alone. We left the church at 6 a.m. 42 people now. The cart pulled easier over the gravel road. The morning was overcast, cooler, with a low ceiling of gray cloud that softened the landscape into something almost gentle. Punch ranged ahead at a trot, nose sweeping the air, and I watched him with the same attention I'd once given to anesthesia monitors, constant, calibrated, looking for the number that changes. Highway 21 appeared at 9 a.m. as a dark line across the horizon, elevated slightly on a road grade, with vehicles visible on it, stopped empty, doors open. We approached cautiously. The highway was a 4-lane divided road, and it was a graveyard of the evacuation that had preceded us. Cars, trucks, an overturned RV, a school bus with its stop sign still extended, all empty, all stopped. Whatever had happened here had happened fast enough that people left their vehicles and continued on foot, and what had made them leave was evident in the stains on the asphalt, and the shattered windows, and the single shoe lying in the median that Bree stepped over without looking down. Devin walked the highway for a quarter-mile in each direction and came back with a revised map in his head. Westbound lanes are clearer. We can move on the shoulder. But there's a pile-up about a mile west, big one. Trucks, can't see past it. Anything moving? I asked. Not that I saw, but visibility's limited. Lots of vehicles to hide behind. We turned west on Highway 21. The column tightened instinctively, people walking closer together, talking less, eyes moving. The abandoned vehicles created a maze that channeled our movement and blocked our sight lines, and I hated it. In the open fields I could see threats at a distance. Here, every truck cab was a question, and every gap between vehicles was a potential corridor for something to emerge from. Punch didn't like it either. He moved differently on the highway, lower, tighter, his ears rotating constantly, his body carrying attention I could read like a vital sign. He was working, scanning, processing inputs at a speed and sensitivity I couldn't match with my limited human hardware. We reached the pileup at 10 a.m. It was a cluster of vehicles, 2 semi-trucks jackknifed across both lanes, surrounded by a compressed mass of cars that had slammed into them, and each other in a chain reaction. The wreckage blocked the highway completely. We'd have to go through it, climbing over hoods, squeezing between crumpled doors or around it, through the drainage ditch and up the embankment on the far side. I was calculating the ditch road when Punch stopped dead. Not the slow hesitation of the farmhouse. A full stop, weight back, every hair on his spine raised. A sound coming from his throat that I had never heard from a dog, and hoped never to hear again, a vibration so low it was almost subsonic, felt in the teeth more than heard in the ears. "Stop," I said, and the column stopped. I looked where Punch was looking, into the pileup, into the shadows between the jackknifed trucks, where the light didn't reach, and the vehicles formed a cave of crumpled metal. And in those shadows, movement. Not one shape, not 3, many. A density of figures packed into the cool, dark spaces between the trucks, standing in the compressed stillness of the infected, at rest, motionless, silent, conserving something that wasn't energy exactly, but was close enough. dormant. Devin appeared beside me. He looked into the pileup. He counted under his breath. I watched his face go through a sequence I recognized from veterinary emergencies assessment, calculation, the moment where the numbers resolve into a plan or a retreat. 30, he whispered. Maybe more. Deep in the shade, they're sheltering from the heat. I looked at our column. 42 people strung along the highway shoulder, the cart with Frank and Ruth 20 yards back, Adiz leaning on the rail, Bree on Marcus's shoulders with her face buried in his hair. Ditch, I said. South side. Quiet. We moved 42 people through a drainage ditch in silence. That sentence is simple. The act was not. The ditch was 4 feet deep and lined with gravel that shifted and crunched under every step. The cart wouldn't fit. Frank Heaton had to be carried. Devin and Caleb lifted in between them like a stretcher case. His fractured leg rigid and his face white with pain, he channeled entirely into his grip on their shoulders. Ruth Pemberton was guided down the embankment by 2 women, whose names I learned that morning, Sheila Dumas and Pat Kerrigan, both in their 50s, both from Festus, both possessing the specific physical competence of women who had spent decades managing households, and were now applying that management to the end of the world. I went last. I always went last. I stood at the lip of the ditch with Punch beside me and the pry bar in my hand, and I watched the shadows inside the pileup for any sign that our sound had registered. Nothing moved. The figures in the dark remained in their dormant compression, packed together in a way that wasn't huddling and wasn't crowding, but was something biological, a clustering behavior, like bats in a cave, seeking shade and stillness and the absence of stimulus. I dropped into the ditch. Punch followed. We moved west below the sight line of the highway, gravel crunching despite our care, and I counted every step and measured it against the silence from above. 50 yards, 100. The pileup receded behind us. I climbed the embankment and helped the cart back up, and we were past. Nobody spoke for the next mile. The group moved with a new kind of quiet, not the absence of conversation, but the presence of knowledge. We'd walked within 30 yards of a mass of dormant infected and survived because of a dog's nose and the structural luck of a drainage ditch. The margin was that thin. It would always be that thin. At noon we found water. A creek crossed under the highway through a culvert, and the water was running clear, which meant nothing about its safety, but meant everything about our morale. We stopped. People drank, filtered through cloth, refilled containers. Anise checked her patience. Frank's pain was bad, and she administered half of one of her remaining tramadol doses and watched his face slowly unclench. Adaizi sat in the creek, up to her ankles, and closed her eyes. And I saw her lips moving and realized she was praying in a language I didn't recognize. Marcus found me at the edge of the rest stop. We've covered maybe 15 miles total, 45 to go. I know. At this pace, that's 3 more days, minimum. I know. He looked at me with an expression I'd been receiving from people for 2 days, the look that said, "You seem to be in charge. Do you know that?" I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't wanted it. But somewhere between the fairground and the drainage ditch, the group had decided I was the one they looked to. And the decision had been made not by vote, but by behavior. I was the one at the back, watching. I was the one who read the dog. I was the one who said, "Stop and go and ditch," and the one who'd said no to Warren Griggs when he offered the faster path. Leadership, it turns out, isn't authority. It's just the willingness to be last. We pushed on. The highway straightened, and the terrain opened slightly fewer vehicles. Better visibility. The road cutting through low hills dotted with cedar. Punch relaxed incrementally, his hackles lowering, his gait returning to the easy trot of the morning. I trusted his body more than my eyes, and let the relief enter me in small, controlled amounts. The way a niece administered the tramadol, enough to function, not enough to fog. At 3 p.m., Devin found the vehicles. They were parked at an angle on the highway, shoulder 2 pickup trucks and a large cargo van. Doors closed, keys missing, gas tanks showing half on both trucks and a quarter on the van. They'd been abandoned in order, not in panic. No shattered glass, no blood, no signs of attack. Someone had parked them and walked away, perhaps following a military escort on foot. Devin hot-wired the first truck in 11 minutes. The engine turned over with a cough and then a roar that sounded to 42 exhausted people, like the voice of God casually suggesting that maybe everything might work out. We loaded the immobile into the truck bed. Frank, Ruth, George, the medical supplies. The second truck took a Daisy and 6 others. The van took 20. The rest walked alongside as Devin drove the lead truck at walking pace. Hazard lights blinking, Caleb in the second truck, Marcus driving the van. I walked at the rear with Punch and the pry bar because someone had to. And because I'd learned that the person at the back is the person who sees the thing coming before it arrives. We covered 10 miles before the first truck ran dry. The truck died on an uphill grade with a cough that was almost human. Devin coasted it to the shoulder, climbed out, and looked at the fuel gauge with the expression of a surgeon who's found exactly what he expected to find during an operation, and is disappointed anyway. The second truck had maybe 2 miles left. The van, a few more. We were on a stretch of Highway 21 that ran along a ridge with farmland falling away on both sides in long, gentle slopes. To the north, perhaps 5 miles out, I could see the outskirts of a town, a water tower, a cluster of rooftops, the metallic glint of what might be a commercial strip. According to the map, that was Caledonia. Population, I'd learned, around 170 in normal times. Whatever these times were, they weren't normal. We transferred everyone from the dead truck to the remaining vehicles and continued. The second truck died 2 miles later, as predicted, and we repeated the transfer. The van carried us another 4 miles before Devin pulled over and shut the engine off. "Saving the last bit," he said, "in case we need it sudden." We were within sight of Caledonia. The town sat in a slight valley below the ridge, organized around a single main street with a gas station, a hardware store, a post office, and a volunteer fire department. From the ridge I could see no movement, no lights, no smoke. The town was either empty or very quiet. Punch stood at the ridge line and sniffed the wind coming from the valley. His ears were forward, his tail neutral, not alarmed, not relaxed, processing. "What do you think?" Marcus asked me. He was asking the dog through me. "He's uncertain," I said. "That's not a no. That's not a yes. We need fuel. We need food. That town has both." "I know. We can't go around. There is no around. The highway goes through it." I looked at the 41 people behind me. They were arranged along the road shoulder in a line that was starting to look less like a refugee column and more like something with structure, the strong on the outside, the vulnerable in the center, the watchers at the edges. They'd organized themselves without being told, the way a herd arranges around its calves. We were becoming something. I wasn't sure what, but it had a shape. "Devin, Caleb, Marcus, and me," I said. "We go in first. Everyone else stays on the ridge with Anise." "I'm coming," said a voice behind me. Sheila Dumas, arms crossed, jaw set, holding the brush axe with the comfortable grip of someone who'd split her own firewood for 20 years. "You need more eyes." She was right. 5 of us went down the ridge toward Caledonia, spread out to Nalonayat, moving along both sides of the main street, checking windows and doorways with the careful attention of people who had learned in a drainage ditch 30 miles back what lived in the spaces you didn't look into. The town was empty. Not just quiet empty. Doors unlocked, houses open, a plate of food still on a table in the diner, furred with mold. The gas station's register was open, bills still in the drawer. And the pumps were functional because the station ran on a propane generator that had shut off when its fuel ran out, but the underground tanks still held gasoline. Devin found the manual pump access, and within an hour, we were filling every container we had. The hardware store gave us more. Batteries, flashlights, a hand crank radio that Caleb spent 20 minutes tuning until it produced, from the static, a single repeating broadcast. This is FEMA emergency alert. Evacuation centers are operational in Rolla, Fort Leonard Wood, and Springfield. Proceed to the nearest center. Avoid all urban areas. This is FEMA emergency alert. Rolla. It was real. It was operational. It was maybe 30 miles away. Marcus and I stood in the hardware store and listened to the broadcast cycle 3 times. The voice was recorded. Flat. Institutional. The voice of a system that was still functioning somewhere, even if it had abandoned us. Marcus looked at me and I saw it happen in his face. Hope. Not the pale, provisional hope of maybe. The structural hope of a destination confirmed. "We can make it," he said. "Yeah," I said. "We can." We brought the group into Caledonia at dusk and set up in the volunteer fire station, which had bay doors that rolled down and locked, a concrete floor, and a kitchen with running water from a gravity-fed tank on the roof. 42 people in a fire station designed for 2 trucks and 8 volunteers, and it felt like a palace. Bree walked along the row of hanging turnout coats and touched each one, reading the name patches with the slow deliberation of a child in a museum. That night, we ate canned chili heated on the fire station's gas stove. And for the first time since the fairgrounds, the group ate together. Not in shifts, not in ration lines, but together sitting on the bay floor with bowls in their laps, talking, occasionally laughing. A man named Dennis Herrera played harmonica badly, and nobody cared. Adaiz sat against the wall with her plate balanced on her belly and told Bree about the baby, how it kicked at night and how she'd sing to it in Igbo. Bree asked what Igbo was. Adaizi said it was a language from far away. Bree said, "Can you teach me?" And Adaizi said, "Yes." And that single word, yes, traveled through the room like warmth from an opened oven. I sat outside on the fire station apron with Punch and the pry bar and the hand crank radio, listening to the FEMA broadcast repeat. 30 miles to Rolla. We had fuel in the van, enough for maybe 20 miles. We had food for 1 more day. We had a road that, according to Devin's map, ran through increasingly rural terrain with small towns every 5 to 10 miles. We had 35 walking-capable adults, 7 who needed vehicle transport, and a dog whose judgment I trusted more than any intelligence briefing. We also had a problem I hadn't told anyone about yet. When our scouting group had cleared Caledonia, I'd walk the south end of town alone while the others checked the gas station. I'd walked past the last house on the main street, past the town limit sign, to a point where the road curved and I could see back along the highway toward the ridge we'd come from. And on that highway, at a distance I estimated at 2 miles, there was movement. Not a cluster, not a group, a line. Figures walking north on the road, spread across both lanes, moving with that purposeful, arrhythmic gait. I'd counted for 60 seconds and stopped counting at 40 because they kept emerging from around the curve. They were following our sound corridor. The vehicles, The highway noise, the 42-person acoustic signature we'd been producing for 2 days. They were behind us, and they were coming at walking pace and walking pace, sustained without sleep or fatigue or doubt. Closes distance on a group that has to rest. I'd walked back to the gas station and said nothing. Not because I was hiding it, because I was calculating. 2 miles at infected walking speed was roughly an hour. We'd be inside the fire station by then, doors locked, invisible. They'd pass through the town, following the residual sound north. And by morning, they'd be ahead of us or dispersed. That was the theory. At 10 p.m., I heard them. Not the vocalization. I was too far for that. The footsteps. Dozens of feet on asphalt, a rhythmic, continuous, a sound like very light rain on a hard surface. Punch stood up and pressed against my leg and stared south with his ears pinned flat. I went inside and closed the bay door. I found Marcus and told him. He didn't panic. He went white, but he didn't panic. We woke Devin and Caleb and Sheila, and we sat in the dark kitchen and listened as the sound grew, peaked, and moved through the town like weather. They passed, most of them, through the main street, past the fire station, continuing north with their blind, purposeless drive. But some didn't pass. Some stopped. I could hear them outside the bay doors, that low vocalization, the slow shuffling, the sound of hands touching metal. Not pounding, touching, exploring the surface the way a person explores a wall in the dark. We sat in silence for 3 hours. Nobody slept. Bree was in Marcus's lap with her face against his chest and his hand over her ear. Anis held a suture needle like a weapon, which it would have been useless as, but the holding was the point. Frank Heaton lay on the floor with his eyes open, watching the bay door with the steady gaze of a man who had decided that fear was an expenditure he couldn't afford. At 2 a.m., the sounds outside stopped. At 3 a.m., Devin opened the side door 1 inch and looked. The street was empty. The figures had moved on, following whatever gradient of sound or heat or blind navigation pulled them north. "We leave now," I said, "before light, before they come back." Nobody argued. We drove. The van held everyone if people sat in laps and stood in the cargo area and pressed together with the intimate compression of strangers who no longer had the luxury of personal space. Devin drove. I sat in the passenger seat with Punch on my lap and the pry bar between my knees and the gas station map unfolded across the dashboard. Route 72 west toward Rolla was a 2-lane road through terrain that was equal parts forest and pasture, rising and falling over the Ozark foothills with curves that the van took at 40 miles per hour, which was too fast for the road and too slow for my heart. The headlights cut a tunnel through the dark, and in that tunnel the road was clear. Then it wasn't. A bridge. A narrow concrete span over the Merrimack River, and on it, vehicles. 3 cars and a truck arranged across both lanes in a pattern that wasn't random, it was a barricade. Built by humans, not by accident. And behind the barricade, light, flashlights, figures moving. Devin stopped the van 50 yards from the bridge. The headlights illuminated the barricade and the people behind it. And I counted 6 all armed, all standing, all pointing their lights at us with the aggressive hospitality of people who had built a wall because the world had taught them to. A man walked around the barricade and approached the van. He was carrying a hunting rifle in the casual, barrel-down manner of someone who'd been carrying it long enough that it had become an extension of his arm. He reached the driver's window, and Devin rolled it down. "Where are you headed?" "Rolla," Devin said. "FEMA Evacuation Center." The man looked past Devin into the van. at the compressed mass of faces and bodies, and his expression went through a calculation I recognized because I'd been making it for days. How many? How desperate? How dangerous? "Roll us full," the man said. The words fell through the van like a stone through water. I felt them land in my stomach. I saw Marcus, in the rearview mirror, close his eyes. "Full," Devin said. "They hit capacity 2 days ago, turned people away at the gate. Some went to Fort Leonard Wood. Some came back this direction. We've been stopping vehicles, telling them, saving them the trip." "Fort Leonard Wood, that's still open?" "As far as we know, it's military. They've got perimeter, infrastructure. 60 miles south-southwest." 60 miles, again. The number that kept reappearing, as if the distance to safety was a constant, a fixed radius that moved with us, always the same, no matter how far we walked. I leaned across Devin. "Is this road clear to the fort?" The man looked at me. "Mostly. There's a cluster in Newburgh, maybe 20-30 infected. You can bypass on County Road 5050, adds 4 miles, but keeps you clear. After that, it's open to the fort gate." He paused. "You got fuel?" "Barely." He stepped back and waved to someone at the barricade. A woman jogged over with 2 plastic gas cans, each maybe 5 gallons. She handed them through the window without ceremony. "That'll get you there if you don't idle." I looked at this man, sunburned, armed, standing on a bridge in the middle of the night, and I saw the counterweight to every Warren Griggs the world had produced. The person who builds the wall not to keep people out, but to redirect them toward safety. The person who gives away fuel they might need, because the math of survival isn't always subtraction. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. "Move fast. Dawn brings them out." Devin filled the tank. We crossed the bridge through a gap the barricade crew opened, and we drove into the dark toward Fort Leonard Wood. And the van was silent, except for the engine and the road noise, and Bree's voice, very small, from the back. "Are we almost there?" Marcus said, "Almost, baby." It wasn't true. It was 60 miles. It was ours. It was a bypass through unknown terrain and a military gate that might or might not open. But he said it anyway, because some lies are architecture, they hold the roof up while you build the walls. We drove. Punch slept in my lap. The sky began to lighten, and somewhere south-southwest, a gate was open, or it wasn't. And we were driving toward it with 10 gallons of given fuel and 42 people who had walked out of an abandoned fairground and through a drainage ditch and past a town in the dark, and who were still here. All of us. Every single one. I held the pry bar across my knees, and I watched the road, and I did not look back. Fort Leonard Wood opened its gates at 7:42 a.m. I know because I checked my watch, the same reflex as the morning the helicopters left. The brain reaching for structure when the world shifts. The MP at the checkpoint scanned our van, counted heads, and waved us through without asking for a manifest. There was no clipboard. There was no category. There was only a soldier saying, "Pull forward, park on the right, medical tents are straight ahead." I sat in the van after it stopped, and I didn't move. Punch was awake in my lap, watching the base through the windshield with mild interest. Around me, people were climbing out, helping each other down, and Anise was already walking toward the medical tents with her bag over her shoulder. Marcus lifted Bree out, and she stood on military concrete and looked up at him and said, "We're here." Not a question, a confirmation. I carried the pry bar with me when I finally stepped out. A sergeant looked at it, and then at me, and said nothing. I found the communications tent, and I gave them my daughter's name and her father's address in Carbondale. They said they'd check the registry. 3 hours later, they told me Emma was alive. Carbondale had held. She was in a shelter at the university. I sat on the ground outside the communications tent with Punch beside me, and I pressed my forehead to my knees, and I breathed. Not the slow, deliberate breath of someone performing calm. The ragged, honest breath of someone who had carried a weight across 60 miles of broken world. And it just, for the first time, set it down. I still had the pry bar. I still had the dog. I still had 41 people who were somewhere on this base, being processed, being counted, being assigned a category. This time, we were all on the list.